Clinical trials can be slow and antiquated and expensive, and sometimes it can be a lot of guesswork. But guess what? Large language models and generative AI have completely changed the way that companies can discover new drugs and bring new treatments to the market for all of us. So, I think a lot of times when we think about generative AI, we think about productivity and we think about, oh, now we can have all of this unstructured data and we can use it in ways to, boost our company or, grow our career. But it's about more than that, right? It's also about improving the quality of our lives and offering new opportunities to people. So that's what we're going to be talking about today on Everyday AI. So what's going on, y'all? Thanks for joining. My name is Jordan Wilson, and I am the host, and this is for you. Everyday AI is your daily guide to grow your company and grow your career to keep up with everything that's happening in the world of generative AI. So if you're listening on the podcast, thank you as always. Make sure to check out your show notes. We always have related episodes, way to reach out to us. Send us a message if you want. And if you're joining us live, thank you as well. So before we get into today's conversation, let's first start by going over the AI news. And as a reminder, we will be recapping today's show and everything that's happening in the world of AI in our free daily newsletter. So make sure you go to youreverydayai.com and sign up for that free daily newsletter. All right, so let's talk about what's happening in the world of AI news today. So first, AI employees are banding together to warn the public. So a group of current and former employees at top AI companies just published a letter voicing concerns about the dangers of unregulated advanced AI and are calling for more oversight and transparency from companies. So this is signed by some current and former employees from companies such as OpenAI and Google DeepMind. But this group is concerned about the potential for AI to cause serious harm if not properly regulated, including inequality, manipulation, and even human extinction. Wow. All right. So they believe that employees are in a unique position to hold companies accountable, but are often restricted by non-disclosure agreements and lack of whistleblower protections. Yeah, pretty big topic there. So interesting that this group of employees is coming out and speaking about it. All right, next in AI news, well, Elon Musk has confirmed why he diverted so many NVIDIA GPU chips from Tesla to his other company, xAI. So Elon Musk has confirmed that he did redirect thousands of GPU AI chips from Tesla to his companies X Corp and xAI. So the move was made, what he said, due to a lack of space for the chips and potential conflicts with NVIDIA. So he redirected 12,000 NVIDIA GPU chips from Tesla to xAI. And he said it was due to a lack of space for chips. But many are talking that it is due to his ongoing battle to have a little bit more voting control at Tesla. So interesting that he's, taking from his left hand and feeding the right. All right, last but not least, the US Treasury Secretary is sending warnings about AI as well. A lot of AI warnings today. So Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warns of both opportunities and risks associated with the use of AI in the financial system. She also noted that current AI models can be opaque, produce biased results, and lack proper risk management frameworks. And regulators, including the Financial Stability Oversight Council, are monitoring the impact of AI on financial stability. So, yeah, we will have a lot more on those stories and everything else in our newsletter. So make sure you go to youreverydayai.com and sign up for that free daily newsletter. And, always hit me with a reply. I read them all, so let me know. All right, but today we're not here to talk about the AI news. Well, we at least got that out of the way, but we are here to talk about how AI is changing and creating really the next generation of clinical trials. So I am excited today to bring on my guest. There we go. We have Saurabh Jain, who is the executive chairman of TrialKey AI. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Jordan.
All right. So, hey, for everyone out there, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you all do at TrialKey AI?
Yeah, totally. Look, I'm a software engineer by trade. Spend a lot of my time on the tech side of things, and then these days a lot more on the commercialization of tech. So right now I'm on about half a dozen company boards, and one of the companies I'm super interested in is TrialKey. So the problem that we try to solve is what we did is we got 350,000 clinical trials. We built our own custom large language model to get about 700 variables of each trial. So these are things like, the condition, the patient, the sponsor, the sites, the medical components within that clinical trial. So it turned all this unstructured data into structured data, and then we use that to try to predict the outcome of clinical trials.
Mm,
And 3.5 years later, with a whole bunch of investment, we can do that now with about 90% accuracy. Um,
mm.
so it sounds super crazy, but we can predict whether a trial is going to succeed or not before it starts with 90% accuracy.
Yeah, and maybe before we dive into that a little bit and
Mm,
talk about, things like unstructured data and improving, clinical trial accuracy, maybe can we talk a little bit about what this has looked like traditionally, right? So kind of
mm.
before generative AI and before large language models. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about, well, first of all, why do we need clinical trials? What do they do and how have they historically worked in years or decades past?
Yeah, totally. So just some of the real foundational things around clinical trials. So you go back about 100 years ago, or a couple hundred years ago, anyone could claim anything about any medication and pop it on a bottle. Um, and some stuff worked, some stuff didn't. Some people died, and the government thought, "Hey, we should actually totally regulate this." And this is when medicine started to really come together, when it became like an evidence-based pursuit. So you'll have, animal trials, then you'll have first in human trials, then you'll have phase one. Phase one is much more around safety. Hey, is what we're doing giving this drug or treatment to somebody causing any harm? Phase two is more around efficacy. Hey, does it actually work? And then phase three is efficacy, but at a much, much larger scale. Then sometimes you have phase four or you go direct to market. So the idea is this rigorous process, which takes about a decade for most trials, for most drugs from start to finish, is designed to weed out stuff that doesn't work, that causes harm to people. So then, the stuff that does get into people, more often than not, it works quite well and it doesn't cause any unknown side effects.
Mm. So that's wild to
Hmm.
me to think that sometimes it can take a decade or more, right? So what we're saying is in theory, a pharmaceutical company or a group of scientists, might actually have something that could help
Hmm.
today, but it could take ten years, right?
Oh, totally. And look, I'm generally quite an optimistic person. So one of the great silver linings around COVID was kind of awesome, right? Like all of humanity banded together to solve a single problem. And you had like 1,000 labs around the world trying different COVID trials. And we kind of got something out to market in a tenth of the time that normally would have happened. Sure, it probably took like insane amount of resources and insane motivation to do, but that's the only time that there's actually been like a quick drug to market. Otherwise, it's just a decadal problem. It takes a decade from inception to something being on the shelf that's actually treating people.
Mm. So, speaking of the kind of time around COVID, that kind of coincided, a little bit after, kind of this surgence of large language
Mm,
models, so uh, GPT technology became, available in 2020, started rolling out in, popular customer facing applications such as ChatGPT in 2022. So,
mm,
how, I'm curious because you do have a background,
yep.
in this area. In general, I mean, I think some people saw ChatGPT and they're like, "Oh, this is kind of a toy for, writing blog posts or something like that."
Mm,
So how would you say that in your field, generative AI and large language models were initially perceived?
totally. So, first I say like ChatGPT, I did not think in my lifetime that would be a solved problem. I didn't think that someone would be able to solve the Turing test. I thought that would be like something my kids would do, or my kids' kids would do. So when I did my thesis about 20, 25 years ago, it was all about predicting cancer in patients. Back in the days, Java 2.0, you had to hand roll everything, 80,000 lines of code, and you could build a model that was about 50% accurate because we only had structured data. So it's only structured data in fields that a clinician actually wrote into like an Excel spreadsheet, like this field means this field means that. And the really cool thing that ChatGPT did, it let us go from unstructured data to structured data. So, for example, you upload a clinical trial to ChatGPT and you ask it what compound was used. And it goes, does its thing, and it comes back and says, great, this is the compound that was used. You'd ask it how many patients were in this trial, where were the sites, where are the locations, who funded it. So all of a sudden, you kind of have access to all of humanity's knowledge that you can now put into a format that you can actually put into a decision engine.
And, what were some of the early concerns around using large language models as well? Obviously there's things that we all deal with, right? Like hallucinations and,
Mm.
is this model actually, using the data that we give it, context windows, et cetera. What were some of main, just the industry kind of went through in general when it came to implementing tools like large language models in clinical trials?
So it's a couple of things. One is all around the hallucination or having blanks, or having incomplete data sets. That you don't, that's kind of hard to solve on the LLM side. You can kind of hyper tune them and make them more focused, but you're always going to have a bit of that. So what you want to do is you want to solve that on the actual precision engine side, the predictor side. The other kind of concerns I guess we had, or the issue had, was how does this work for novel drugs? Like, how does this work in a data set which the world has never seen before? Um, and then we did a whole bunch of work, and I'll kind of tell you some of the interesting stuff that we found out around that. But they were the things like, how do you deal with scenarios that have not happened before, and then how do you deal with kind of incorrect data coming through?
Mm. And how do you think so far, because those are, obviously things that you have to take into consideration. How has the industry kind of responded to some of those concerns?
Yeah, totally. I mean, keep in mind that probably no one that we know is kind of doing AI clinical trial prediction design to the extent that we are. So it's still very new to the industry. Like we only launched to market like 2 or 3 months ago, so it's super early days. We only got our first set of paid customers using this. But generally, what you find, it's a completely different approach. So the way it traditionally works is like a lot of these things are based on like a clinician with years worth of experience about certain drug and certain disease. Now the downside of that is no single clinician can have like a complete knowledge set. Like no one can actually know everything that's happened in every clinical trial over 350,000 trials over 20 years, but an AI tech computer totally can. So AI will find connections that a person will never see.
Mm.
When we show people our tech, the first thing is surely that's not right. Surely that's not believable. That does not make sense. That's even a solvable thing. But when you bring up their trial and talk through their experience and some of the stuff the data shows, that's kind of when you get them on side very, very quickly.
Yeah. And speaking of, you mentioned some of those things, taking in this data from, all of these, 35,000 clinical trial, right? Right. So all of these, or sorry, 350,000 clinical trials,
350,
all
yep.
these different variables, and improving the accuracy of clinical trials. What does this ultimately mean for, on the front end, right? Like, how can this influence, whether it's pharmaceutical companies, research organizations? How can this data and kind of what your company is working on, how can this influence them, and maybe in good ways or potentially bad ways, on what they maybe should or shouldn't focus on?
Totally. Well, I mean, probably the even the thesis that we have is that everything about how humans interact with drugs and devices is already known. Like that knowledge already exists in the world, except it just happens to be in a crappy kind of way across 350,000 clinical trials. We've just brought that together in a single AI model. So now, if I'm a pharmaceutical company, I can get an insight into things that I actually just didn't know before. So our big claim to fame now is we can predict whether a trial succeeds with about 90% accuracy before you start. Super crazy, super not credible, but that's actually what we can do now. So if you think about that from a pharmaceutical perspective, like we think there's three main use cases. One use case is that we'll probably just make free because it's like good for the world is for patients. If you have a loved one who wants to go on a clinical trial, we'll help you figure out which trial to get on, which is most likely going to succeed. So then they have the best chance. If you're a pharmaceutical company and you've got 100 trials across different drugs, we'll help you figure out which trials are most likely going to succeed. So you can over-index and over-invest in them, and you might call out the ones that are least likely to succeed. Or if you're doing a new trial, we'll help you through generative AI design the best possible trial.
Mm.
Then the last use case, which I didn't see coming, but it's still a thing, is for the investment community. So we did this for a company last week. They're going out for funding, osteoarthritis company. We did a model for them to predict their likelihood of success of completing that trial. So when they go off to investors, they can say, great, we've got an X percentage chance of succeeding, this much more than our competitors said, please invest in us. And then on the flip side of that, something the CTO and I do for fun right now is we invest in pharmaceuticals with our own cash. So
Mm.
You buy before a company announces a clinical trial inflection, share price goes up, and you sell afterwards.
Yeah. And something I'm curious about, and we talked about this, briefly before the show.
Mm.
This can obviously help companies save a lot of money. Number one, yes, it does bring drugs and treatments faster to the market, which helps humanity, right? It helps us all, hopefully live higher quality of lives. But what about,
Yeah.
companies that may be too focused on the commercialization piece? Are there going to be maybe now drugs or types of diseases that maybe just go undiscovered or unresearched, mainly because hey, we are able to now make more money, or we're able to just focus on these
Mm.
bigger problems that have a larger pool of potential customers and clients. So I guess, how can companies balance that, and is that something where smaller or rarer diseases maybe aren't going to get explored at the same rate?
Totally. So, what tech like ours does, it makes it like a near perfect capital allocation in the market, where money goes. It's like meritocracy, right? If you're most likely going to succeed, you'll invariably get more investment and more funding. And most pharmaceutical companies are not philanthropic enterprises, right? They're there for a profit motive. So the kind of things you want to figure out is, how likely am I to succeed? How does that compare against my competitor set? And so we've applied machine learning to figure out, like, who's your competitor set, like who's trying to solve the same problem, albeit with different ways. Some people might have surgery, some might have devices, some might have drugs, some might have any other interventions. And who's most likely going to succeed, and when do you think they're going to succeed? Because the theory is, you want to get out to market with the most uh, if you have an invasive intervention model or ingestion method, i.e., you have to take a needle versus a tablet versus a cream, you're going to find it's going to be harder to get to market. If someone else solves that problem with a much easier ingestion method or another model kind of thing, they'll probably succeed. So allow you to see, okay, I'm actually going to succeed after these guys. They're more likely to succeed than I am. So allow you to kind of choose, well, is this the best use of my capital? What
Mm.
that means for rare diseases. So I'll use COVID as an example. So this company started about a year before COVID, and there were about 400 vaccine candidates at the time. And we predicted Pfizer and Moderna as number one and two, and AstraZeneca as number seven. And history has shown, we published that out, we've sent those results out, got published, and that's kind of what happened. So what that meant is, not because of us, because we weren't really known back then, but those three succeeded. Now they've been over-indexed in terms of funding. The Moderna is investing a hell of a lot in mRNA, and they've been able to get a lot more kind of cash because they've done that. The other part around kind of rare conditions, I think what's going to happen, unfortunately, is the money will go to the problem that's easiest to solve,
Mm.
that has the biggest payback versus its competitors. So you'll have things like diabetes, weight loss, cardiovascular, cancer will be over-indexed in terms of probably investment, and some of the rare genetic disorders will probably just get less attention.
Mm. What is, I guess, what new problems then might arise, right? Like, might there, kind of before generative AI and before large language models
Mm.
could predict the likelihood of something working, it seemed like, I don't know, from an outsider's perspective, I don't know much about the space, but you would think that, companies would be investing equally in all of these different areas and all of these different problems and diseases to kind of see which one worked. So if large language
Mm.
models can actually take out some of that guesswork, I see how it's a good thing. But then how can you still, whether it's the industry, your company, or, society, how can we still make sure that people are researching and investing in these areas that are these rarer and maybe less profitable, or less with a smaller kind of pool of people that are suffering from these diseases?
Yeah, so what you'll probably find is that clinical trials with tech like ours will iterate a lot quicker. So as you said, it takes right now a decade, right, to go from start to finish. What you'll find is it might still take that long, might shave a few years off, but be doing less trials. So right now, humanity does about 35,000 trials a year. I'll probably drop to 5 or 10,000 trials, but it leaves lots of bandwidth to go and solve other things. And as long as there's a good capital model or incentive, or some way that incents people to go solve some of the other problems, that will probably still happen. Because luckily, not everyone does this for a pure financial motive. People have personal experience and those kind of things. But you'll find some of those rare conditions, they'll probably get funding now when they couldn't otherwise get funding. Because they'll be able to run a clinical trial in an AI simulator, be like, awesome, I think I'm going to solve this problem. I'm a 72% chance of success. Baseline is 10%, so I'm 7 times more than any other. And and to the investment community to try to get funding for something like this.
All right. Sorry, y'all. It seems like we're having a little bit of a connection issue. Hopefully that gets resolved here. So one thing,
Back in,
one
sorry.
thing, there we go. It sounds like we had a
Now
little
we're
bit of a
back again.
connection
Yep.
problem there. So, one thing, I'm curious about. So, you said that, your company has
Mm,
essentially, built a model that helps you, pull out and extract all this data from 350,000 clinical trials, 700, different variables. What are some of the things kind of regardless of, how this can be used in the future? What are some of the things that your company has found, when looking at all of that data? Because I'm sure that there's
mm,
kind of like what you said earlier, I'm sure there's connections that large language models can make that humans can't. So, what are some of the things that you've found
mm.
in your process of creating this model for others to use?
Let me ask you a question, and it's a trick question. What do you think is more important in a phase 3 trial, the actual drug or the way the trial is succeeded? So the way the trial is designed, what do you think is more important on whether a drug works and gets through approval or not?
I'm gonna well, trick question.
It's a trick
Love
question.
them. Yeah, so I'm gonna guess the second. I'm gonna say how it's used because regardless of the drug, if it's not used correctly, it's maybe not relevant. That's my guess. What's the
That
answer?
is that is totally it, right? Look, it makes
Oh,
no sense. Like, I'd actually say, "Oh my god, the drug is so much more important because if the drug doesn't work, nothing else matters." But you're fine. There's about 80% of the probability of success is about how the trial was succeeded, so how the trial was designed. The drug only accounts to about 20% of the likelihood of success. Because keep in mind, in phase two, you kind of prove some level of efficacy. That's how you kind of get to phase three. And so if you think about, well, if 80% of my chance of success is about how my trial is designed after the event, or some people do on the side, it's not the main dish.
mm,
Um, and that's totally crazy, totally not credible, but that's actually what the data shows.
mm,
The other thing that I reckon the data has shown us as well is there's lots of orphan drugs, drugs that actually were really good, were going to be super efficacious, have a lot of efficacy, but they never got taken to market because they had a crappy trial design. Because the principal investigator, the doctor, the chief medical officer didn't design a great trial, or what didn't have enough funding, or couldn't do what they wanted to do, and they never got some amazing drug to market.
mm. You know, so one thing I'm curious about is,
Mm,
I kind of think right now people who are doing knowledge work, right? So they're reading, PDFs and they're creating outlines and pitches and presentations. To me, it seems kind of wild if people aren't using generative AI in their day-to-day work.
mm.
When it comes to clinical trials and the future, might that be how we view clinical trials in a couple of years, that if companies aren't using large language models, if they're not using, digital twin simulations, like how do you kind of see the future of this playing out?
Yeah, totally. Look, as I said, there's about 35,000 trials that happen in the world. I reckon that's going to drop to like 5,000, and there'll be millions and millions of trials that will happen in an AI simulator. And at some point in time, you're going to have ethics committees that will be like, it's completely unethical to test a drug in a human person unless it's been done in an AI simulator. So the analogy I gave you beforehand was it's a bit like learning how to drive, right? I learned how to drive like 20, 25 years ago. It was super dangerous. I'm so lucky I never killed anybody. But everybody who's 17 and learns to drive are horrible, right? And my kids will probably never learn to drive in a real car. They'll go to the DMV, they'll learn how to drive in a simulator, they'll have to pass a test in a simulator. And we'll talk about how back in the olden days we were super unsafe and let people learn on the roads. And the
Mm.
exact same thing will happen for clinical trials. At some point, it'll be like, that's crazy, right? In the dark ages, we actually tested drugs in people before in the AI world.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about it, but I can see both sides of that, right? So I can see how,
Mm,
oh, it seems wild to not test certain drugs on humans if humans are the ones that are ultimately taking them. But kind of the AI side of me says, okay, it might be a complete waste of time and you might be withholding, great new discoveries from the population that can help if we are using humans. I'm curious, you said that 20 some years
mm.
ago wrote your thesis on AI and being able to detect cancer. So, where do you even fall personally on that? Do you ever struggle with, balancing this concept of using generative AI and using large language models with the human in you that's been doing this for decades?
Oh, totally. Look, I mean, I think so. You'll always still do a trial in a person because, like, you can't simulate everything in the human body in AI, and humans are so different, so unique. But I think what will happen is before it's done in a person, it'll be done in AI, and that will cull out a lot of trials that don't should never happen or not be safe or probably not succeed. And then only the best ones will be done in people. So it just kind of means that you put less people through unnecessary trials, right? You put less people in harm's way of drugs that they actually shouldn't take, or drugs that are probably not going to succeed.
Mm,
The other thing that it does do for people as well is one of the models that we've built. It's all around trying to figure out, hey, I have this drug candidate. What are the conditions this could solve? So I might have a drug that works great for, I don't know, hair loss, for example. But hey, it helps with acne as well. So before you do a trial in people for acne, you can actually run that through an AI simulator and we'll recommend all the other conditions we think this therapeutic could actually work for. So it might actually really expand out the scope of different treatments in different areas as well.
mm. That's super interesting. And maybe could you, for those of us unaware, because we talked about, oh, it could take maybe a decade in some cases for
Mm,
a good discovery or a good drug to finally go to market. So where are we at today? For companies who are using, whether they're using your service or one of your competitors, what does that look like today in terms of, months, years, and also cost? And then what can you see that, being in the future? So kind of walk us, current day
mm.
companies that are using it, and then in the future, what that looks like in time and money.
Yeah, totally. Look, unfortunately, it still takes a decade. Like uh, FDA legislation regulation is not kind of caught up to AI.
Mm,
But what it means is when you start the journey, you can be more confident that you've got a model or a clinical trial that's going to succeed. So theoretically, there'll be less failures along the way. Like we'll get that meritocracy that we spoke about. Um, but I think what will happen over time is as we get more and more generative AI and we design more trials from scratch for doctors or for clinicians, we'll hopefully speed up the process a bit, call off a few months here, a few months there. But I reckon it's going to be 10 years, maybe 15, before you get like the FDA to
mm,
consider clinical trials in AI as a proxy for what actually happens in people. The one exception I'll actually give is one of the things we're working on now with a client. It's what they call real world evidence. So instead of running a trial, go collect all the evidence what's happened in this area across the last 10 years, collate that into a virtual trial, and submit that through for approval. So the TGA, that's the authority in Australia, similar to the FDA, they've started to accept some real world evidence trials. They don't have the same kind of bar as a clinical trial, but it's a great way to start for some alternatives, some vitamins, and some of those kind of things.
mm. So that's, yeah, it's interesting, right? And also a little disheartening maybe, right? That
Mm,
all of these technologies are helping this field advance, but still the slow turning wheel of a big organization like an FDA can still slow down things for everyone else. So we've talked about a lot of things here, but as we kind of wrap up today's show, we've explored a lot of different ways that AI technologies can really help in the future of clinical trials. And we've talked a little bit about some of the old
mm.
school and antiquated processes, but maybe what's the one takeaway that you hope that people can keep in mind as they look at the future of how AI is used in clinical trials?
Yeah, so if I take a step back, not just in clinical trials, but like any kind of similar problem set. So what we've actually done, and this is what the co-founder's genius was. He's found a world clinical trials in this example where there's 1,000 variables or 700 variables in our case. You have a known outcome, and you want to figure out what variable leads to that known outcome. So we just happen to apply that kind of to clinical trials. Uh, you apply that to sports. And basically, anywhere where you've got a whole bunch of variables that lead to an outcome, you can now, for the first time ever using AI, actually figure out what variables lead to that outcome. Um,
Mm,
and I think that generic solution set will now solve a lot more problems around the world, I think.
mm. I love to see it. I another great example today on how generative AI is really shaping our future in a good way. So this was a great conversation. So thank you so much, Sharab, for joining the Everyday AI Show. We really appreciate your time. All right. And hey, as a reminder to everyone, we covered a lot today. So make sure to go to youreverydayai.com, sign up for the free daily newsletter. We'll be recapping everything that we talked about and more. You can find out a little bit more about the company there that we talked about today, Trial Key AI, as well as keeping up with everything that's going on in the world of generative AI. So thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you back tomorrow and every day for more Everyday AI. Thanks, y'all.